Good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to the MIT Museum and to our discussion on democracy in the age of AI. And I'm delighted to see that many of you have already discovered the Mentimeter and are sharing with us the values that have brought you here tonight. And if you haven't done it yet, please scan the QR code and share whatever value it is that brought you here. I'm excited to see that curiosity and humanity and democracy are holding the leading slots. I saw liberty earlier, which I thought was an interesting one because it seems to combine liberty and beer, so I can quite identify with that one personally. We have an exciting evening in store for you tonight. This is an event which is part of the MIT Museum's Cambridge Science Festival, which is a huge festival involving over 300 events in 1 week, all around Cambridge, put on by an extraordinary team here. So I'd like you to give a big hand to the museum and the festival team for all of their work organizing this. It's really pretty amazing. So today we will be exploring the potential of AI tools to increase participation in democratic processes and explore also new technological approaches to giving voice to those who are sometimes excluded from public discourse. I'm very honored to introduce today's panelists. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Claudia. Claudia Chwalisz is an author, activist, and entrepreneur. She's founder and CEO of DemocracyNext. She's an international research, she is not. It is an international research and action institute working to shift political and legislative power to new democratic institutions anchored in citizen participation, sortition, and deliberation, such as citizens' assemblies, about which we'll hear a little more later on. Please come to the stage, Claudia. Our second panelist is Deb Roy. Deb is Professor of Media Arts and Sciences right here at MIT, and he directs the MIT Center for Constructive Communication, also known as C3. He leads research in designing human AI systems, fostering dialogue, listening, and deliberation in ways that build civic muscle. Deb is also co-founder and CEO, unpaid CEO, I read, of Cortico, which is a closely affiliated not-for-profit collaboration that the center runs, developing, operating, and supporting a conversation platform designed to surface underheard voices and perspectives and create scalable dialogue networks. So please come to the stage. Deb Roy. And our final panelist and our guest of honor here tonight is Audrey Tang. We're delighted to have Audrey here all the way from Taiwan. Audrey was the first digital minister of Taiwan and has also been the world's first non-binary cabinet minister. In her 20s, Audrey rose to prominence as a leader in free and open source software, revitalizing the Haskell and Perl programming languages. In her 30s, Audrey played a crucial role in shaping Gov0, which is spelled G0V, one of the most prominent civic tech movements worldwide. And she's also helped develop participatory democracy platforms such as Taiwan and Join, bringing civic innovation into the public sector through initiatives like the Presidential Hackathon and Ideathon. Please welcome Audrey Tang to the stage. So, welcome everyone. And just a little bit of housekeeping to mention to you that today's event is being filmed, and there will also be some photographs taken during the evening. So I hope everyone is okay with that. Then also to let you know that we will be taking questions from the audience, also through a QR code, which will be appearing magically behind me momentarily. So this is the QR code. So all you have to do is just click on the tab which says Open Q&A, and then share your questions. And it's also possible to upvote the other questions that you find particularly interesting. And then later on, Marina will be helping to share some of those questions with our panel. Maybe just to get us started, just to do a bit of a straw poll of the audience in the traditional analog fashion, I would like to ask, who among you thinks that AI is a threat to democracy? Can you maybe put your hand up? So I would say, yeah, that's about 45%. And who among you would think that AI is actually an opportunity to enhance democracy? And it's okay to put your hand up twice as well, if you want. Yeah, so again, probably maybe, about the same amount, about 45%. So that's interesting. So it'll be interesting to see by the end of the evening if you've changed your view. So the World Economic Forum published its 2024 risk report, and it stated that misinformation and disinformation driven by AI is the single biggest risk for the world over the next 2 years, driving further political polarization, the number one risk for the next 2 years. In August, as many of you may remember, Donald Trump both accepted a fake AI-generated Taylor Swift endorsement as real, and almost moments later complained that real images of crowds attending a Kamala Harris event were in fact AI generated when they weren't. And the discussion has intensified even since August. And in fact, just today, some of you may have seen, did anyone see the New York Times article today in relation to AI and democracy? So actually there was an article just today which features Audrey Tang quite prominently and relates to the publication of the new digitalist papers, a new Stanford University report on AI and democracy in America. Typical Stanford, trying to preempt MIT in this regard by publishing the report just before our panel event. But this really, I would recommend reading it and also having a look at the report. It has very diverse perspectives on the question of AI and democracy, and it's very relevant to our topic this evening. I would like to open the panel discussion by mentioning one remark that came out of that report today, which is Professor Larry Lessig. Larry Lessig is known to many of us. He's a professor nearby in Harvard. And he observed in his essay in the Digitalist Papers, which are kind of a riff on the Federalist Papers for the digital age, he wrote that observing that AI could be used for good is like observing that bulldozers could be used to help build affordable public housing. It is possible, of course, but is it likely? And with that, I would like to turn to you, Deb Roy. So how did we get to this point? And do you think that there could be a more constructive role for AI and democracy?
Well, thank you, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me and everyone for coming today. I think, Lessig's example or sort of analogy of thinking about the bulldozer is actually a useful one. So just, I think I'll play with that analogy and see where it takes us. So, first of all, you would use a bulldozer to create affordable housing. It would be a useful tool for that. So first of all, it's not absurd to think about that. When I think about the analogy to AI and large language models, and so I'm guessing I'm going to take as for granted that everyone here knows about, has probably played with a large language model like ChatGPT or Gemini, et cetera. And so, okay, what's the connection between a bulldozer and a large language model? They're both powerful. When I think about the affordances or kind of the bias of a bulldozer, it's designed to be destructive. Even when you're constructing something, its actual role is to be a kind of a destroyer. So I think about another technology that has a destructive bias, the gun. And it's interesting then to make a contrast between a bulldozer and a gun. You're much less likely to have an arms race of bulldozers, I think, than you are of guns. And so there are other properties beyond is it powerful? Is it prone towards doing destruction versus being kind of somehow constructive, or maybe a microscope is maybe neither. It's kind of something that lets you learn. And then is there some kind of a social dimension that once some people have it, others want it, and it can kind of spur some kind of arms race or sort of cycle. So here I think large language models have power. They're powerful. They kind of amplify human kind of intentions. It's less clear whether we know how to build a steering wheel and the kind of controls that we have in place for a bulldozer. It's definitely not clear how to put the rules in place for when something damaging is done with an AI technology, how to kind of enforce those rules. I think with any new technology, there's a period where we need to figure that out. I think most intriguingly, for me, when I think about the power of AI, and in particular large language models is a good example, it's not clear at all that they are pro-destruction versus pro-construction. It feels powerful, but pretty neutral, like every language technology before it. The printing press, radio, television, et cetera, social media, that how you deploy it is going to affect the impact, but it does seem to have a similar quality as the gun, in the sense that as some people start using it, I think it's natural for others to use it. We communicate with each other, and if the AI is changing how we communicate, others are likely to adopt it as well. If nothing else, if I suspect that, you wrote, Russell, you wrote me a note, and you use a large language model to rewrite the note, I'll probably want to use a large language model, a piece of AI, to decode and say, well, what did Russell prompt his AI so that it wrote this, kind of beautiful language? What was actually the intent behind? So there's, various ways we can imagine this kind of an arms race. So I think thinking about these analogies is helpful, but also thinking about the different properties. So I guess I'll summarize all of that by saying it's powerful. It has constructive and destructive properties. So it's probably part of why, when you all raised your hands, we had a rough balance. By the way, I was really impressed with the 45%. I was wondering if Michael John is an AI. How did he get that precise readout? But 45 to 45, there's a balance of sort of seeing that constructive and destructive balance. So that's...
So both constructive and destructive. So Audrey, I'd like to turn to you now. And we are, of course, in this country very focused on the looming elections. I think it's an interesting moment also to look abroad, to look further afield into international examples of how perhaps AI and democracy can come together in different ways than this weaponized disinformation and misinformation that we are hearing about so much. And your work in Taiwan is often cited, in fact, even today in the New York Times, as a shining example of how AI can support different approaches to deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies and also alignment assemblies. It would be wonderful if you could maybe share with us, what can we learn in the US from Taiwan in this regard?
Yeah. In terms of election-related mis and disinformation and deepfakes and so on, I think by far deep learning and large language models make it easier to make like imperfect copies that could pass, right, as something that people feel as true or as real, unless we pre-bunk. We make sure that the entire society knows that there are deepfakes coming. It's now very easy to synthesize in any people's voice, in any people's likeness, which is what we did 2 years ago. I deepfaked myself and spread that video to people in Taiwan and saying it, now it takes 20 minutes, but soon you will just take 20 milliseconds, and at that point, everyone will be able to wear anyone, and that is coming. And because of that, and we pre-bunked saying that there will be such deepfake videos accusing of election rigging and miscounting and things like that. So we installed like citizen supervisions in the counting stations and so on. So there were such deepfake attacks and polarization attacks, but because we pre-bunked that, we survived the election kind of intact. But there's also other threats caused by deepfakes that are not election related. For example, online fraud, where people just deepfake a celebrity endorsing some sort of, I don't know, crypto investment or things like that. And to put a guardrail on those behaviors. Sometimes it's easier for the government to say, okay, we'll just regulate these and these behaviors. But in Taiwan, we don't want the government to basically curtail speech, to curtail content, and so on. We prefer for the people to come together and set the clear boundaries on liabilities on platforms and so on. So that's what we did right after the election. We sent 200,000 SMS text messages to random numbers in Taiwan with just one single question that says, you know, deepfake is coming. How do you feel about information integrity online? So anyone can write in their answers, just like that Mentimeter that we just did. And then if they want, they can tick this box that says, I want to volunteer an entire afternoon, almost an entire day of my time into this online chat room where I'm willing to deliberate, to have a conversation with 9 fellow citizens on this particular topic. And so out of people who volunteered, we use something called stratify random sampling to have a sortation, a random selection, but to ensure the 450 people are statistically representative of the Taiwanese population in terms of age bracket, gender, their occupation, and place they live, and things like that. And so they came together online in rooms of 10 each, so that's 45 rooms. We work with Stanford on the platform, so the chat room itself facilitates the conversation. It's not a human facilitator doing the facilitation, but people just look at the policy feelings and not really proposals at that point and try to discuss so that after a while we can see of those 45 rooms, they coalesce around some good ideas. And so we can then use language models, but not to confabulate or hallucinate anything, but just to link together the ideas that kind of resonate with each other into more coherent policy ideas. For example, there's an idea that says the platforms like Facebook or YouTube, when they're posting advertisements, if it's featuring a celebrity and so on, they need to secure the digital signature, the know your customer of that particular person, as well as people who fund it. And if they don't, and somebody get conned for $1 million, then that platform need to be liable for that $1 million, and so on. So it's a kind of joining of multiple strands of ideas, and then together we read it back to the plenary, and we ensure after deliberation, more than 85% of people do agree with such concrete proposals, and then they were made into draft law in May, and now it's passed in Taiwan. So Taiwan is one of the few jurisdictions that has this full liability law without the state assuming too much powers, because we can just limit ourselves to the agenda that is set by the people. So I hope that illustrates two things. First is that actually people of different political affiliations, like 3 major parties in Taiwan, once they see after deliberation, most of people agree on those concrete measures. You can pass these measures in a relatively non-politicized fashion. And second, most people after this kind of conversation online, they do feel this kind of inoculation in their mind, so that they're not swayed by, you know, this is a state overpowering the private sector or is a control on content and so on, but rather they come up with the policy suggestions by themselves. So AI does play a good role in summarizing and finding the resonating points among the people.
Wonderful. And so you are quite a big believer then in this idea of mental inoculation or pre-bunking. You find that that is actually a strong approach to dealing with misinformation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you already have this kind of experience working with people holding different opinions and coming to common understanding, then you are less likely to be swayed by the polarizing or the more extreme version of the stereotypes. And I think there's research that shows this effects lasts months or if not years, so that if you have went through that kind of deliberation, it also protects you against nearby adjacent outrage and extreme versions.
Mm-hmm. And just before I move on to Claudia, I was wondering, just since it did come out today, this Digitalist Papers publication, you have an essay in that with 2 of your colleagues, which is called A Vision for Democratic AI. Could you share with us maybe succinctly what the vision for democratic AI might be?
So it's a simple idea in that you can use some of the same deliberative content and in the format that produces a code of conduct for AI models to serve in a particular role. For example, we can have a conversation about how a AI in a facilitator role should behave, for example. And then if we, like people here, have a conversation, a deliberation, and settle on a kind of constitutional document, a model specification, then it is possible to train a community model that specifically tunes an AI to work in that particular role, and we call it a community model. And if it misbehaves and things like that, then we can easily supervise it with that document we co-created. And so it's both a document that's easier to understand as kind of guide rails and guardrails, but it's also something that language models nowadays can just accept as input and just tune its behavior toward the community norms.
Thank you. Moving on to Claudia. So, Claudia, often when we discuss democracy, we're thinking in terms of our traditional political institutions, and you are interested also in how community listening and technology can help us to create democratic processes also in other kinds of institutions. Can you talk a little bit about how you are doing this with DemocracyNext?
Yeah, so I think well, when we typically think of democracy, we tend to think of the institutions that we're familiar with. Like, we have images of voting and elections and debate that come to mind. But in many ways, these are historically actually very recent associations that we have. And if we take a sort of wider step back out of what do we mean by democracy and how could we be reimagining democracy but also drawing inspiration from ancient practices that have always been considered democratic, we've actually lost a lot of those practices in the institutions that we think of today. So a lot of the work that I'm doing at DemocracyNext is inspired by these practices of, for instance, sortition. So Audrey also mentioned this word. It's a practice of randomly selecting decision makers. So how do we apply that in contemporary times using the possibility of stratifying, which is just a technical word to say ensuring that a group is then broadly representative of a community? How do we also create conditions that enable deliberation rather than just debate? So deliberation meaning collectively weighing evidence that we hear with an intention of coming to shared decisions off the back of it. And a modern manifestation of these principles has come through in this movement of citizens' assemblies and other kinds of what are called deliberative democratic practices. So to make that sound less abstract, you know, Michael John, you're from Ireland. Some of the best examples or some of the more well-known examples come from where you're from and where you first came across these ideas too. So back in about 2012, there were the first Irish citizens' assemblies on constitutional change, where there were people selected by sortition, so randomly selected from amongst the Irish public, that came together over the course of many months to deliberate on numerous aspects of how the Constitution of Ireland should change. So today, Ireland has passed four different constitutional amendments following referendums that have happened because of these deliberative assemblies on same-sex marriage, on abortion, also on other issues like blasphemy and divorce. But they've also then been using these assemblies on other kinds of legislative issues like climate change, gender equality, drug policy reform. So we've seen so many examples, not just in Ireland, but around the world, demonstrating quite concretely and pragmatically that we can be practicing democracy in a different way that doesn't necessarily just revolve around our parties, campaigns, campaign financing, elections, that we can be practicing and embodying this, and technology can be playing a role to enhance these kinds of processes instead of trying to replace that very human practice, making it something that is qualitatively better.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you spoke about citizens' assemblies, and indeed I'm very partial to them because of the Irish connection. I do wonder, I mean, in Ireland we like to chat. We're very kind of conversational culture. Do you think there might be a case that citizens' assemblies are embraced more? Because I know, for example, there's been a lot of discussion in Germany of trying to have more citizens' assemblies, but it's not quite taking on quite as quickly. Do you think there might be a kind of cultural specificity to where citizens' assemblies work well, or is it something that you think can be universally applied?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they can be applied in many different cultural contexts. I think various cultural aspects manifest themselves differently, but before founding DemocracyNext, I was at the OECD where I led a big study looking into what now has over 700 examples of citizens' assemblies like the ones I described in Ireland that have taken place all over the world. Japan actually has the largest number of examples, many parts of Latin America, all over Europe. I mean, I've been involved in assembly processes that have taken place in Finland and in Spain and in different, and even in those two countries, they're both in Europe. It's slightly different cultural manifestations of how chatty people are and other things, but to me that doesn't negate the possibility of these principles being applied in those various contexts.
And you were telling me briefly about something that's going on right now in Bend, Oregon. Can you tell us a little bit about that process and what's at stake?
Yeah, so we've been involved as DemocracyNext, also actually with MIT C3 and a whole host of other collaborators and partners for a citizens assembly project that's taking place in Bend, Oregon, in Deschutes County, actually. So it's the different jurisdictions that are Bend City Council, but also Deschutes County and the Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council in terms of the different governments. And there's a citizens assembly process that they have all come together around to tackle the issue of youth homelessness. And for a bit of context, Bend is a city of about 100,000 people that has grown really rapidly in the past few years, and it's surrounded by a fairly rural county. And politically, there's quite a difference of partisanship. So from a few different perspectives, this project is interesting because there's this cross-partisan urban-rural divide of people being randomly selected from across this county. There's a group of 30 that are broadly representative of the diversity of this area that are deliberating over the course of 5 days to come up with propositions that will go to these various organizations. And the other aspect of what's interesting in this context is we're also partnering with MIT C3 on the tech-enhanced aspect. So it's going to be the first citizens' assembly that's taking place, which will be fully recorded, including all of the small group conversations that will take place during this. So I think for the future of some of these assembly processes, it sheds light on a different way of thinking about how technology can be brought in and how we can be using AI in constructive ways, that even for these in-person processes, we can be bringing it in to add a lot of value in terms of the transparency and visibility, understanding of this process for a wider public, but we also have many ideas in terms of how we could be using AI and other technological aspects to be able to share insights from between the different small groups, for example, have AI-generated summaries. How could we visualize this conversation data in different ways? So I think we're just at the very beginning of what will be a rich exploration of how technology can be enhancing this. And I think the intentionality of, yes, we can also be thinking, and we are thinking about the design of how this technology can enhance hybrid or fully online processes, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of the benefits and the intentionality of needing more of these in-person structured moments of deliberation that bring together diverse groups of people for lengthy periods of time. Because going back to your mention of misinformation and that being one of the biggest problems, to me that's just a symptom of the problem. And we can do lots of things to deal with the symptoms, but we also know from the research that people who are most prone to even believing or seeking out misinformation or disinformation are people who are the most socially isolated and lonely and lacking connection. And I think the work that we're all doing is rather building the processes and institutions that get to those deep drivers of the problem and not just the symptoms, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Mm-hmm. So this is a question really for all of you. What would you see as the kind of essential ingredients for a good deliberative process. And you've talked about a couple of different kinds of processes. You talked about citizens' assemblies, these alignment assemblies. But what would you see as kind of key ingredients for a deliberative process? Maybe Audrey, would you like to?
Yeah, for me, the most important thing is always a pre-commitment to act on the deliberative results, because otherwise it's just a dissipation of social energy, right? So sometimes it's like very binding, like leading up to a referendum, that's the most binding. Sometimes it's purely consultative, like saying the topmost consensus will be read before the city council or before the ministerial meeting and so on. And it's okay to have like less binding or the most binding, but one need to be very upfront about that, because that determines how much trust people put into the process. And if it's just goes nowhere, then it actually decimates people's trust into future processes.
Thank you. And so Deb, pre-commitment from Audrey, what do you think are the key ingredients to a successful process?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that pre-commitment is incredibly important. Otherwise, this dissipation of social energy can lead to also a lot of negative consequences, loss of trust in the process itself, and then it's less likely to get uptake. I think that maybe second only to pre-commitment is investments in transparency. It's kind of like the proverbial tree that falls that if no one hears it, doesn't make a sound. Similarly, if an assembly even does have some kind of political consequences, but it's largely unknown what happened. It's largely unknown that anyone could have been invited in. It's largely unknown that dissenting views or opposing perspectives were considered in the deliberative process. All of these kind of internal components, which are so important to how this process works, which, again, if this still sounds kind of abstract, the closest thing in America that's widespread in use is the jury system, where you deliberate, right? And it is open to a very vast portion of the population, and the process is well understood, and creates a kind of trust, right, in just who is in the room and how that process runs. So it's the kind of building that awareness, having, and I think here are some of the possibility for technology becomes, I think, clearer, that can you allow ways for the public to understand what went into the deliberation, and after some result comes out, and even the pre-commitment, let's say, holds, what actually happened. Were there people that reflect my perspective that were in that room, right? And then why didn't my point of view end up shaping the output? If I can get answers to those questions, I might not like the output, but I might come to trust the process. And so I think visibility, transparency, and sort of that kind of educational learning component needs to be wrapped around a process like this.
And do you have, from your own experience in using Cortico and other tools, do you have an example maybe of really difficult communications impasse that you've had to engage with, where this process has actually helped? Can you kind of maybe make it a bit more tangible in terms of?
Sure. Not in the context of a citizen assembly, which is actually what's brought us together with DemocracyNext. But maybe just to mention very briefly what is Cortico, and the work that's happening in the Center for Constructive Communication. In a nutshell, is having spent years studying social media and some of the limitations and some of the harms, potential harms of social media, we started what began as a research effort at MIT, and then with this nonprofit Cortico, we've been able to translate some of that research into tools and practices to essentially combine small group conversation with a technology layer that, with the consent of people involved, we can record those small conversations and then find patterns across conversations, lift those patterns up, and then in various contexts bring them into different kinds of use, including building this kind of transparency and understanding of underheard voices and perspectives, and also bring it into decision-making processes, which is what, with citizen assemblies, for us, is kind of taking that idea of decision-making to next level. So just kind of give you one example, we found ourselves invited into a high school community, Freeport, Maine public high school, and there was a real communication breakdown between student leadership at the time in this high school and the school administration. There was some new diversity and inclusion policies that were introduced in the high school, and there was a strong backlash from many members of the student body in the form of graffiti in the bathrooms, slurs, repeatedly, that led out of running out of options. The school administration and the principal locked all the bathrooms in the high school except for the two next to her office. And so it was in that context, and the administration had been working with some of the high school student leadership to try to work through this, understand where the discord was coming from, and maybe make some changes to the policies. But there was such deep distrust between these two groups that the communication had broken down. And so this process and using the Cortico approach actually enabled the two sides to restart a conversation. And the role of technology and some early forms of the AI that we're now developing was to allow, and there's more than a technology story here, there's also something about human agency. So the high school student leaders were actually supported in inviting their own peers into small group conversations. They used prompted dialogue, where our team helped them come up with prompts that allowed students to actually take a step back from what they're angry about with the issues in terms of opinions and just share what they're experiencing. And with consent, the student leaders recorded their peers' small group conversations and then used the Cortico tools to actually find patterns of shared experience across small groups. And then a critical thing happened. The school administration came together and met with the student leaders, who both used data visualizations and analytics to explain some of the patterns of what they heard, but then they would also play what we call highlights, excerpts from these conversations. And actually, we'll hear some highlights from a different context later this evening. And hearing the human voice of some of the students describing what they're experiencing, knowing that was connected to larger patterns with the analytics behind them, actually allowed a conversation to restart. And 3 years later, they're continuing to use this process, and they've made a lot of progress in rebuilding some of the trust that had broken down. So that's, for me, a powerful example where the technology played a key role, but there are other elements that had to come together for it to work.
I'm going to go shortly to the questions from the audience, and I hope you've all been able to enter questions using the QR code. But before I do that, I mean, just building on that example. So you've mentioned Cortico. There are other tools. You've worked with Chwalisz, for example, and I'm sure one could mention many other tools. It'd be interesting to have your thoughts on what are the interesting tools out there that people can experiment with. But there's a kind of bigger question of, it's wonderful to solve a communications problem in a high school, but how can we hope for, with the legacy systems of government that we have, for example, in this country, how can we hope that these kinds of approaches and processes could kind of scale to the level of transforming our legacy political system? Maybe Audrey, do you want to start on that, and then Claudia maybe.
So just for context, Chwalisz is a tool that is a little bit like social media in the sense that you can post something and people can say like or unlike, but it's not antisocial in the sense that it highlights the common ground among people who disagree with each other's sentiments. So like in 2015, when we first used Chwalisz, is in the context of conversation around Uber. So you can see a fellow citizen's sentiment, like they feel insurance is very important, or that not undercutting existing meter is important, or that serving rural areas is important, and so on. But there's no reply button, so you can't get into an argument with that person. And so whether you like or unlike that sentiment, you see your avatar moving toward the cluster that share your sentiment. But our pre-commitment at the time was that we only discuss the bridging statements that speaks to the majority of agreement among all the clusters. So there's a competition of sorts, but instead of competing on the polarized, amplified, going viral thing, engagement thing, actually the extreme voices don't get a say, because by definition, the extreme voices don't cross that bridge, right? We only uplift the ones that crossed this divides. And so over 3 weeks, people do propose a set of very coherent ideas that we then hold ourselves to account for it, to invite Uber and taxi drivers and unions and so on. And Taiwan passed a law that is crowdsourced by these tools. And I think that actually fed into community notes on Twitter, now x.com, and now on YouTube as well. They share the same bridge-making algorithm in that it surfaces only the one that speaks to people who are originally on different sides and bring them together. And so these tools are open source. So Polis is not just used by ministers in Taiwan. Actually, you see a lot of citizens and media and so on just start a Polis poll as people would start a Mentimeter survey or something like that to quickly gauge both the division, not hiding the division, but also highlighting the bridges that could cross those divides. And once people have the kind of instinct of going to those polls, it doesn't need to be a wiki survey like Polis. It could be a random survey. It could be a sortition. It could be things like that. But just expands the toolbox that people has. And so people think of democracy as something that even on a community level, on the school level, and so on, they can just go to these tools and expect conversation, not just conflict. And then people can see the conflicting sides as energy for co-creation and not shying away, right, from embracing those conflicts. And that is, I believe, what that means by the kind of relationship civic muscle, so that people can feel there's a sense of resilience, like we're not afraid of addressing these conflicts heads on, and we don't have to wait for the city government or a minister to take that into their hands. Instead, we can demonstrate that, not just protesting, demonstrate that consensus. And after a while, I do believe that it changes also the politicians' view on things, so that they can accept these as part of the toolkit to have a conversation with the people. But it does first happen on the civic space, on the social sector, instead of waiting for the public sector to deploy such tools.
Thank you. Yeah, Claudia, how, in your view, how can we go from this kind of local community scale to, perhaps transforming legacy democratic institutions into more adoption of community listening?
Well, I think that we can be thinking about this on all the scales. Like, we need it at the local as well as the regional and the national, as well as in our other kind of institutions of daily life. So actually we're doing work with museums and cooperatives and universities, bringing in these principles of sortition and deliberation into them. So I think that's part of it. But for me, I think I view the work that we're doing as building new democratic institutions. So I don't think that citizens' assemblies are just another tool in a toolbox. And if we see them as new institutions, then we can envision establishing a legal basis for them, which has been the case now in numerous places. So, and when they have a legal basis, then we can imagine them also having more genuine power and links to decision making. Now, I'm not saying or suggesting that we should just replace elected politicians or parliaments and only have citizens' assemblies, but I think that what we're witnessing and is showing us that things could be different is this movement to be institutionalizing citizens' assemblies. So, for example, in the city of Paris, it's now been a few years that there's a permanent citizens' assembly that exists alongside the elected city council, and just this July, they wrote their first citizen bill that was adopted by Paris City Council. So they had worked, it was 100 people selected by sortition, broadly representative of Paris. They worked from September of last year until June of this year. So actually, to add a few points to your previous question, I think time is the other key thing that's needed actually for legitimacy, for quality decision making, for the positive aspects of the social connection, etc. So they worked for that entire period of time, having 5 plenary sessions, 11 working sessions, 7 site visits, and then 3 working sessions together with the elected officials to get to a point of actually drafting a bill that was adopted. And so the process, for example, we're doing in Oregon that I referenced, there is a pre-commitment to respond to the recommendations, but after 5 days of deliberation, these will just be recommendations. They're not in any kind of stricter legal form. Whereas I think that the longer these processes are, the more time there is to learn, the more time there is to really work towards that shared level of consensus and to work to something that has a greater weight and power. And for me, it's kind of step by step. How do we build more of these institutions to be starting to shift power and change people's sense of another kind of democratic future really being possible?
Yeah, fantastic. And I'm really interested in even thinking about the future of the MIT Museum, actually, how we can become a museum which builds community listening into its practice. But yes, Deb, over to you.
Just want to add a point, because we're thinking about, the role of AI in all of this, that if time is important in investing human time, and our mind immediately goes to, oh, AI can automate this, it can automate that, it can make things efficient, make things faster. The question is, how do you design systems that bring humans and AI together that actually creates that space for time? And so one of the things that I often see is a kind of presumption that if you can automate, you should. Because efficiency, because economics, because then it can scale.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think that makes sense. Other times it actually might have the opposite effect of what we're looking for. So, how do you harness this power of this stunning new power, right? Makes bulldozers look like nothing, right?
Yeah.
What AI can do, but not just focus on making things go faster, right? Sometimes you need some other way to harness the power. So. I sometimes, when I think about civic muscle and we think about the value of technology in the mix, I use the analogy of if I want to build physical muscle and I go to the gym and someone says, good news, we've installed this new technology. It's a robot, it'll lift the weights for you. Well, that kind of defeats the purpose of building civic muscle. So if we want that kind of resilience and that ability to sort of believe that you can change things and you don't have to wait for the government, then the last thing we'd want is the AI to do all the work for us, right? And so just because it can doesn't mean it should. And so I think that's one of the real moments we're in, that we have this new capability. Are we going to ask it to lift the weights for us, right? Or just spot us when we need it?
Yeah. And so I think now the moment has come. We've been talking a lot about community listening, and I think it's time for us to actually listen to our community here. Marina, you have been keeping an eye on the questions that have been upvoted, and would you like to share with us? Can I give you this microphone?
I would love that. That helps a lot. And just to remind you all, you can upvote the questions, and that's how I'm selecting, not the ones I find most interesting, but ideally the ones you all as a collective find most interesting. The one by far that was most popular so far, hopefully is practical and easy to answer. How can we tell if something is AI generated without having to extensively research every piece of information we come across?
Who would like to take that one?
Well, I mean, the kind of consensus from the alignment assembly in Taiwan was that if somebody digitally signs it and say they own that piece, whether it's AI generated or not, they own the repercussions, then we can say that that's somebody else's work. And if it's not signed, we just assume that it is AI generated. This is kind of the norm. We, after deliberation, kind of settled that.
I think I would say something very similar but in different words, which is if you think about how you today decide what to believe, is it true or not? So much of what we believe, we actually don't have the expertise and the ability ourselves to determine. So in some ways, the problem, it's new that AI can create things that we can't tell apart. We just can't tell from looking at the surface characteristics. It's what are the networks of trust you're embedded in that you look to for signals for whether to believe this piece of information or not, right? Is this true or false? So whether it's a digital signature or some other way to determine, should I trust this? Any more than, should I swallow this pill and trust that it's good for me? Who in this room can really fully determine, with their own chemical experiments or whatever? I can't, right? It's all about networks of trust. So, but definitely with a new problem that's emerged.
Do you want to, I mean, not everyone has to answer every question, but you're welcome to. If you, okay, let's take the next one then. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great start. We had a couple questions about people with disabilities. So this one in particular was popular. How can we, as people, protect people with disabilities, especially intellectual disabilities, from the potential AI discrimination damages? What kind of policies can we put in place proactively?
Great question. Who would like to, would you like to try that one, Claudia? Is that, or do you want to ponder it a bit?
I don't know, I mean,
Or
yeah, this feels kind of adjacent to my deep expertise on things. I think the way it intersects maybe with the work that I'm doing is that I think there's actually a great level of care and detail that goes into the design of both the invitation process, the physical space, the whole process to make it a welcoming experience and a deliberative space where people of different kinds of disabilities, whether physical or mental or otherwise, are able to participate fully. And so there's often training that goes into the moderation team. There's considerations into the physical space as well. And I think this is something that people are a lot more aware of and conscious of in a very good way today.
Thank you. Anyone else care to chime in on?
I want to prompt doesn't community alignment to some degree get to this? If you can define someone who is potentially in a position of vulnerability or harm, if they are part of a community that maybe is underheard, underrepresented in how these AI models are built or
kind
deployed.
of as advocate, and also just to ensure that when we design spaces, they kind of serve as testers to ensure that these systems and this process that we design are universally accessible in the kind of profiles that they're aware of. I mean, one of the first community aligned alignment assemblies that we tried was with Anthropic and the Claude 2 model. They have this internal constitution, but they made the assumption of like people generally walks and so on. And one of the first alignment assemblies with 1,000 statistically representative people in the US pointed out to Anthropic when they're training like Claude 3, like not everybody walks, right? There are people in wheelchairs and so on, so they shouldn't make that assumption. And so I think these kind of community alignment or community tuning, none of which is like the end-all be-all of things. We have all sort of different abilities and so on. So what's most important is to show people that if you see a assumption that is done by a model or by an AI in the downstream, you don't have to feel that you're always downstream, and there is a way to just steer that bulldozer toward a place where less harm is affected on your community or people sharing your particular condition. And so in a sense of nothing about us without us, it's important to then tell the upstream model makers and so on to keep that feedback loop open. And if that feedback loop is open, then I think that the more and more people have experience in the downstream effects of those AI models and AI systems, the more willingness there are people to participate in the community alignment, not necessarily for themselves, but also for the harm they see on their communities and so on.
Just want to ask a quick follow-up, which is, if someone who is has a certain disability is in a minority group compared to the larger population, how does this relate to the thing you were talking about earlier, that with polis, you're using an example, but you're saying in general, the extreme voices don't get a say. But couldn't there be a challenge that that extreme voice is coming from a minority that has a valid concern, but
that's a great question. I mean, the original Uber conversation, the rural places, the rural communities are kind of in the minority when you just count the head count. But actually, most of the people on the larger groups are very willing to make that bridge to get the upvotes, because they need that upvote from that smaller minority group. And so you see a more eclectic reframing or more nuanced way to reframe the Uber policy suggestions, just to win the support from the local co-ops and the local social entrepreneur from those rural places and so on. So I wouldn't say that because of a group have a unique need, they're automatically more extreme, because as if they're willing to consider the more bridge-making statement from the other groups, they're actually the one that has kind of veto power on what is the final agenda to be selected. So there's a lot of nuance that goes into this bridge-making algorithms, but I wouldn't say that just because a group is small, it is kind of more extreme.
Super interesting. I think just in the interest of time, we should allow one more audience question, if there is one.
There are many questions, but there's one that I think does a good job combining several of them, and is pretty popular. How can we do a better job educating the public about how to think critically about AI, especially people who aren't technologically savvy or doesn't think this is their space to work in?
So how can we educate the public into thinking critically about AI? Who would like to take that one on?
I think like if museums had events. Oh, wait a minute. Here we are.
Perfect.
I mean, like, I think there's a lot of ways you could criticize OpenAI, but in making things generally available, one of the original claims they had was there's like a very powerful technology that's sitting behind closed doors, and we want to make it available. Now, I think there are reasons to be skeptical of some of the things that OpenAI leadership has said versus what they have done, if you kind of start tracking. But in terms of sparking a conversation that's become a huge public conversation, having access to the technology in a way that's accessible, I think, is important. You referenced a couple of things that Donald Trump did earlier. In terms of raising the visibility of the fact that you can't just trust that piece of media now, Donald Trump helped raise the visibility by kind of using these examples. So I mean, some of this is now entering the mainstream, but I think that's one element, is just to, and I'm surprised at how many people have heard of ChatGPT or Gemini, but have never tried using it. And I ask why, and often I hear I'm afraid. And that to me is surprising. So I don't know the answer to this, but how do we get over that fear to say, well, it's there. Whether
Just to pick up on that, there was an interesting piece of research that was published, I think, about 10 days ago. It was the cover story of Science, and it was published actually by an MIT researcher, Dave Rand, where they developed this debunk bot. And the idea was to have a ChatGPT-based bot that would argue with people who hold conspiracy theories. And the results were that after, I believe, just 8 minutes arguing with the debunk bot, people had 20% less confidence in the particular deeply held conspiracy theory. So it was a really interesting example, and that is highly accessible. In the week since it's been online, they've had over 50,000 people engaging with this, and I mean, it doesn't necessarily just apply with conspiracy theories. It could be any deeply held belief, but I think that's also an interesting example, perhaps, of how one can increase skepticism. And it's interesting you mentioned museums. I think originally people thought museums were meant to make people believe more things, but I wonder if now we're in a stage where actually we need to inculcate a healthy distrust in the public. But that's a bigger question probably to explore. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, the idea of networks of trust being how you decide what's real. So if we just keep seeding more and more distrust or raising doubts without constructing networks of trust that are grounded in, the right places, right being, including empirically grounded, I think we are in a dangerous slide towards seeding more and more
distrust is definitely not sufficient. Yeah. Claudia, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just a very, very brief point in the sense of I think that also just talking about AI in this way is really abstract to a lot of people, but there's so many specific applications in everybody's everyday lives, and I think there's some onus on the leaders of various organizations to hold spaces both for just dialogue and conversation, but also learning and deliberation. Like, for example, even I'm thinking back to we did this a bit of a pilot student assembly at MIT on this question of the use of generative AI in higher education at MIT. You could think about the question being applied in the context of healthcare. There's very specific applications, and you take this abstract question of AI, you can develop all sorts of different thought experiments around very practical situations that everybody's in, and I think that's also a very effective way of getting people to be able to have a grappling with some of these questions too.
Thank you. So just, we're going to soon close this part of the event. Oh, there's a question in the audience. Do we have a microphone? Actually, we could, or maybe you can shout. Yeah.
Thank you for your comments. I just want to ask, as a sort of a lay citizen, you are all citizens and you've served, perhaps also in governments. You are also experts in AI. What are the expectations that you would articulate, upon each and every one of us as a citizen or as a fellow member of a democracy with respect to AI, given that we don't have the same kind of expertise, the same experiences, but we all, I think we're all in agreement that there are certain expectations we should abide by. So what are the expectations that you would articulate in terms of practices or engagement, from everyone in this room, given your own experiences and insight?
Great question. Who would like to respond?
Yeah, I think the main expectation, if you can call it that, is that we need to insist as citizens that AI remains steerable, that it remains in a place where if there's opaqueness, if there's decision that affects us, that the AI providers say with a sense of exceptionalism, because this technology is hard to explain, they don't have to explain it. Kind of like the original Uber algorithm, they just say that they can ignore the transportation laws because they're more efficient, but exactly how they don't say, right? Refuse to make exceptions to this kind of technology just because it's called AI or deep learning or machine learning. We need to demand exactly the same accountability and explainability and transparency. And if the current science doesn't allow for it to be explained in this way, then we need to invest in the kind of science, in the kind of safety and control and relative measures, and not accept a lower bar just because it's called machine learning or it's AI. That would be my expectation.
We need to be able to steer the bulldozer, is your key. Yeah.
To remain, the steering wheel has to remain on citizens.
Yeah. Just before we're going to move into an exciting next evolution of this event shortly, but before, I don't want to spoil what that's going to be, but before we do that, I just have one kind of closing question for our panel, and I want you to indulge in a prediction. Not of who's going to win the election on November 5th, but going a little bit further into the future. So I want you to imagine that we're coming back to the MIT Museum. It's September 2034, and we are, what has changed? How has AI transformed democracy? What's different? And perhaps I'd like to start with you, Claudia.
Okay, yeah, I think I will turn a little bit the question on its head in terms of starting with democracy and maybe situate it here in Cambridge. What I would, and maybe less of a prediction and more what I would love to see and feel like we have the agency to shape such a future if we want to. And that's, if we came back here to Cambridge 10 years from now, that we have a permanent citizens' assembly that has real power making laws for the people of Cambridge, and people have rotated, and there have been thousands of everyday people who've played a role in shaping those decisions, that all of the cultural institutions, including this one, have set up those permanent assemblies, and people are playing a role in that, that the schools, the universities that are here are also functioning in this way, and that we've been able to start seeing the ripple effects on society, and that AI and technology is, you know, we almost don't have to say tech enhanced anymore. It's just normal because it's enhancing the quality, the transparency, the visibility of all of this happening. So some might call this utopic, but I actually think that the seeds of such a possibility are already being planted, and it's up to us to water them.
It's an exciting vision. Thank you. Audrey.
Yeah.
We invite you back in 10 years.
Great. Right. The first time I visited MIT was actually the MIT Media Lab, and I visited as a double robot. So I was in Taipei wearing this HTC Vive VR headset and just remotely navigating a robot. And it's quite interesting because I kind of feel embodied and in here, but people here just see a like random panel of iPad or something with my face on it. So people really don't feel the nonverbal expressions, the hand gestures, the sense of kind of sharing a space together. But I do think that whatever becomes of humanoid robots and so on, one of the more obvious uses is just to simulate this impersonness of sharing the same space, of making sure that if people cannot afford to fly, maybe because of different abilities and conditions or things like that, currently, like people watching the live stream is in a completely different strata compared to people in person. And how do we bridge this hybrid online-offline gap? I think that is one thing that extended realities or humanoid robots and so on, even without all the agentic stuff being designed in, I think it's just serving as ways to bring people closer together and sharing this embodied space. I think that is something that we can reasonably expect in 10 years.
So we're all going to be joining in telepresence.
Maybe, but you wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
Deb, do you agree?
Well, we've had this conversation now in a couple of pieces. I think that the more we self-select and connect kind of virtually, the fact that we are embodied and our physical body is still sitting somewhere, and that there's more and more contention around soil and other physical resources means that that doesn't go away. In fact, it probably gets worse if we just kind of, disconnect from the physical. So, there's just still the question of what happens on that front. Yeah, I just feel like I am terrible at answering these sorts of questions about what happens 10 years out, because I do feel in the Media Lab, which is where I've long been based, we've made a lot of predictions about the future, and they usually turn out to be false or kind of inaccurate. But the visibility I feel that we all have of what we're heading into keeps getting poorer. It does feel like we're going through a phase shift where there is more and more things that are changing at once that makes it just hard to project 10 years out. 10 years out is actually much further out than it was 10 years ago because things are speeding up. The one thing I feel with this phase shift is there is a kind of instability in terms of what AI is going to do to our sense of personal agency. And sort of that expectation, the question we got of what should be the expectation. When I heard Audrey say that the AI should be steerable, it's that we have belief that we can actually affect change. And it could be very easy to fall into a kind of bread and circus where the circus is brought to you by AI, and it's the ultimate kind of consumption experience where you lean back and you never lean forward again. And so, I feel like something about the phase shift we're going through is one of how decentralized and distributed will the steering wheels be versus something that just continues to tickle our fancy. And what social media showed, if you have enough content produced by we the people, and you have AI that can pick the most engaging pieces and put it in front of us, you can keep us hooked for quite a while. If you can synthesize that content with a level of creativity, let's say by some standards greater than human creativity, and steer it with that same purpose of keeping us engaged, then we might just put our headsets on and never take them off and just be on the IV drip. And so then the question is, who's steering that? So where in 10 years will we be? I feel it's kind of, there's a branching point, but it doesn't feel like it's going to be the same. But I don't know if it's going to go one way or the other.
That's a somewhat darker vision than Claudia began with.
I think it can go either way. And if we get empowered and it decentralizes, then actually democratic processes strengthen. So actually, I'm an optimist. I'm drawn to the kind of optimism, actually, both of Audrey and Claudia. And I think it's possible. But the expectation is on all of us to be not just paying attention, but to assert some level of agency. Otherwise, it doesn't go that way.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for these wonderful thoughts and very provocative discussion. And now we're going to move to a different activity. And I would like to, first of all, thank our panelists. Thank Claudia, Chwalisz. Thank Deborah. Thank Audrey, Tang for their wonderful comments. And great discussion. They are staying here, so there will be a chance if there was that question that was also upvoted that you would like to discuss with them at the end of the session. Please come along. But meanwhile, we're going to move now to a different phase. So Deb, we're going to go to the floor, and you're going to introduce the next part of the session. So over to you.
This is where medley first. Oh, I think we're going to play the medley. I'll introduce the medley and then hand off to Dimitri. Okay. So, okay. So I'll give a little bit of context and then get out of the way. The MIT Center for Constructive Communication in May of this year had we have an annual gathering just of our sort of network of collaborators and students and staff and faculty of the center and a variety of partner organizations and people we work with. And leading up to that event, and the theme of that event was human connection and trust in the age of AI and social networks. So that's what we were convening to have workshops and sort of themed discussions about. Before the event, we had about 125 people gather for a full day. Prior to the event, we offered anyone who was coming to join a small group recorded conversation, which would then be uploaded to the Cortico platform, and we would do this sense-making to find themes of what people shared and bring that into the day's event. So what you're gonna hear in a minute is a roughly 2-minute medley, which are highlights, kind of excerpts from those different conversations, where the prompt that we used in this prompted dialogue with these small groups was, what is a hope or a concern you have about human trust and connection in the age of AI and social networks? So we're just gonna hear a medley of voices, about 2 minutes of how people responded.
When I talk in my social circles, everybody's really, really worried right now. There's anxiety that's palpable.
Are we just going to lose interest in actually talking with each other?
I'm worried about my kids. How will the integration of AI into our daily lives shape the social skills, the empathy, the emotional intelligence of younger generations?
I often wonder, the pace at which we are advancing with the technology is kind of like outpacing everything else in terms of how we're addressing all of this.
The whole prospect of technology providing more and more speed ups, the whole business of figuring out what's right and wrong or good or bad is somehow removed from the field of actual human judgment.
Can technology enable humans to be their best selves or diminish their humanity?
We're on this nice edge in that context between, will it create more human apathy and alienation? Or can it create a sense of freedom and more space for social and human engagement?
If one does really focus and think creatively, there's extraordinary potential.
It's not this like disembodied robot from the future that's coming in. It's something built by humans that humans have to decide what to do with next.
I've been thinking a lot about AI as a collaboration aid, as a consensus building aid, as a decision-making aid.
Can the kind of technology we're bringing into different spaces be helping people to build trust with one another, to listen to one another, for people to feel heard?
We all have different concerns, with different hopes, with different dreams. I think we need to be quick on our feet and always remember that these tools are here to make us be smarter. How do we stay human while the world around us is changing?
So with that, I will introduce Dimitra Dimitrikopoulou, who is the head of translational research at the MIT Center for Constructive Communication, to take you into the next part of the evening.
Thank you, Deb. Welcome to this part. I know that you've been listening very carefully to our panelists, so I'm going to invite you for the next 20 minutes to engage in a participatory activity and think more creatively about what are your hopes and concerns that you have on this topic. When you arrived, you saw that there were some drawing materials on your seat. If you push them away, try to find them. Each one of you has a notepad and a marker. I invite our panelists to also invite us, to also join us in this activity. So what we will be doing is we will be doing some sketching, some very quick drawing. And here you will see that we have two whiteboards. We are in a museum, so you can think of this drawing activity as our contribution to a collective artwork that will become part of this museum and this event. So what I'd like to invite you to do is to think of a hope that you have about the future of democracy in the age of AI, and what is your place in that future. And I want you to make a very quick sketch of this hope, and we're not looking for a realistic drawing. You can think of this drawing in an abstract way. You can draw like a shape or something, or a concept, or whatever comes to mind. Don't overthink it. It has to be spontaneous. It needs to be playful and fun. And we will have only 1 minute for each of the drawings, so it needs to be fast. We're not looking for perfection. It needs to be playful, fun, and creative. So on your first piece of paper, I'd like you to draw what is a hope that you have when you think about the future of democracy in the age of AI and your place in it. What is something that comes to mind? Something positive, something constructive. And then using another piece of paper, I'd like you to draw a concern. What is a fear? What is a challenge that you identify about the future of democracy in the age of AI? We're going to have 2 minutes for both of these drawings. We're going to be listening to some nice music to help our creative juices flowing. And as soon as these 2 minutes are over, I'm going to give you the next set of instructions. So have fun with it, and we'll see you back in 2 minutes. Great, thank you for doing this. I hope you had time to finish both of your drawings. So now please take your 2 drawings, fold each of them in half. And then you're going to be holding one drawing in each one of your hands. And I'd like to invite you to turn to the person sitting next to you. And that person is going to ask you to talk about one of these 2 drawings. You don't know if that person is going to choose your hope or your concern, but the goal here is to describe your drawing, share what came to mind as you listen to this prompt, and then invite the other person to share some of their own thoughts about what you drew. We're going to have 2 minutes to do that, and then I'm going to ask you to shift turns and do the same with the other person. If you don't have, if you're too many, and you can also form groups of 3. It's going to be loud, it's going to be noisy, so I invite you to embrace the chaos and have fun getting to know each other a little bit better. Okay? Can I slowly invite you back? It sounds like you're all having great conversations. If I may slowly invite you back, you're going to have a chance to talk more amongst yourselves. Thank you so much. I hope you had fun drawing. Please keep your drawings with you because we will be taping them on these whiteboards. You will be talking more and exploring more about each other because now you got a little bit of a taste of what the person sitting next to you is most hopeful or most concerned of. So with that, I'd like to invite you to think of the following prompt, which is a little bit more complicated, but this is going to help take the conversation deeper. How can technology create spaces for people to listen to each other, find common ground, and strengthen trust? And how do you see yourself participating in this vision? We're going to have a couple of minutes. Our original plan was to have you meet someone new, but I feel that it's a little bit complicated in that space. You can engage more people in this small group conversation. So think about this topic. How can technology help accomplish this vision of people finding common ground, strengthening trust, listening to one another? And maybe if you see yourself participating in that vision, what could your role be? So we're going to have a couple of minutes, and then we're slowly going to wrap up this part of the program.
Is this a picture as well?
No, that's not a picture. It's actually just free-flowing conversation. No more drawing. Okay, so let's hear from a few people. Can I slowly invite you back? It's so great to listen to all of you being so engaged in the conversation. We'd love to hear from some of you. What is one new exciting thing that you learned today from the conversation you had with the person or the people sitting next to you? What is one thing that you'd like to share back with our group? We can hear from 2 to 3 people. Would anyone like to share something that you learned from? Great, thank you so much. We have a mic here. Kate will help us with the questions.
Thank you. I really enjoyed hearing from all of you today. I think something we talked about, I think we were maybe part of a more pessimistic group, was this tendency for technology to kind of make your private public, that you're constantly being tracked all the time, so kind of think about privacy issues, and also the tendency for technology to globalize, and that there are negatives to globalization, that local community and local connection can also sometimes be impacted by that. And so we're thinking a lot of times on a larger scale and forgetting about our own identities and our own issues and commenting mostly on larger issues and public issues and kind of becoming public. And so I guess if privacy is an integral value to democracy, then is that an acceptable thing to trade off in the name of progress and efficiency?
Thank you so much. We have a few more minutes if anyone would like to share something that you heard today. I would say not from the panelists, but from the people who you had the chance to interact with. What is something you learned that you'll remember after this event? Yeah, you at the end, and then we'll wrap up with you.
So this was from the negative future, and I'll explain what it is. It's somebody looking into a mirror that Courtney drew, and that person is saying, what is real? Nothing is real, everything is generated. So it made me think that, yeah, this is a real risk of reaching a future where there's no purpose, there's a lot of doubt, and to the point of seeding doubt without creating networks of trust. I think, well, it's something I'm taking away from tonight.
Thank you. We have one more person here. And then maybe we have time for one more takeaway.
So I was speaking with my new neighbors, Emily and Aliko, who are from Congo and Cameroon, and something we talked a little bit about is that there is a kind of an inherent privilege in this question, which is that technology is not equitably accessible. And I think it is somewhat arrogant to presume that technology is going to serve as a social facilitator of trust, particularly when there are swaths of populations across the world, or even within the United States, that don't have basic access. And for them, their primary issue is solving immediate problems, whether it is farmers getting their harvest, or nurses ensuring that they have enough supplies. So I think technology can only serve as a social facilitator when it's actually equitized and distributed equitably.
Very important point. Thank you so much. Kate, there was one person here who wanted to share.
So I wanted to share one of the concerns that my new friend Noel brought up that made me think about it in a different way. So he's concerned about the impact of new technologies and generative AI on the environment and on sort of accelerating the negative impacts of climate change. Not that there are any positive, whatever. The impacts of climate change. And I've thought about that certainly in terms of the kind of resources that are consumed by massive computing power and so forth and so on. But he also brought in the human perspective that I hadn't thought of, which is as we as humans are more embedded in sort of virtual realities and behind computers, will we lose touch with the natural environment, and will we stop caring as much? And that was just a perspective I hadn't thought of, and I think it might apply actually to a number of other issues that that we should be concerned about.
It's great to see how these short interactions can actually open our perspective and learn something new. I want to thank you all for engaging with these different activities. Please keep your drawings because we'd like to have them posted here. I have a little bit of a transition, and I'm going to hand this to Deb for the last part of the program. So much of the work that we do at the MIT Center for Constructive Communication is actually design questions and prompts like the ones that you tried today to invite people from different communities to share their hopes and concerns, their values, their experiences, and their stories in a variety of contexts. The conversations that we design are always facilitated, they're always recorded, and the technology that we design actually allows us to analyze and visualize the conversation so that conversation participants and the public at large can start making sense of the themes and patterns that emerge from these conversations. Deb will share a recent example of our work, and we're going to slowly start wrapping up.
Thank you, Dimitra. So I'll just describe, this is still a work in progress, but a kind of a 3-minute video clip from a system that we're building at the Center for Constructive Communication using that Cortico tool. I mentioned that we had an event in May, and you heard a couple of minutes of the medley. These were people sharing some of their thoughts before they came together for a day. May 7th was when we all came together. We had a number of different breakout sessions and plenary sessions, and asked everyone who participated for consent to record those conversations, so that we could then, after the event was over, do this kind of process of finding highlights of what different people had shared, and then have an AI-assisted process to find themes, commonalities that actually came up across the different breakout groups. So what you're going to see in this video, it's a little bit messy, so I'll just describe it and then we'll play it, and hopefully it'll make sense. You'll see bubbles. Each of those bubbles have dots in them. The dots represent specific highlights, excerpts from different things that people said. The bubbles are coming from the different breakout sessions. We were in different rooms and spaces throughout the building in the Media Lab having these conversations. You're going to hear another medley of some of the kind of highlights of what came out of the conversations. And as you're hearing the different pieces of voice, you're going to see rays radiating out of specific dots. The dot that all the lines are coming out from is the highlight you're listening to, and all the dots connected are other highlights that you won't hear, but that had similar themes coming up. And so the whole point of this is, how do we kind of get the gist of what happened across many different conversations and get sort of that, a sense, and both sample some of the voices, see the connection. So it's a work in progress of some sort of a direction we're trying to go in creating these tools to create and visualize these connections. The last thing I'll say is the audio is going to sound messy and kind of a little noisy because that's where it came from, kind of the messiness of people in conversation.
Maybe it's not that it's conflict, but that we're afraid to have a conversation with someone who has a different perspective or a different experience.
And that lack of a sense that, we are a we, and is, I think, the source of the easy blaming that then produces divisions, that then fill the vacuum with all of the anxiety and fear.
And that comes at a time when the local newspaper business has been hollowed out and decimated in a way that makes it harder to do. So if you feel unseen, unheard, unreported on, of course you're going to have less trust in media that doesn't connect.
It's a human experience. All of us want to be heard. And I think if you can remember your fondest memories of talking to your parents, did you feel listened to?
During the pandemic, witness diversity in panels, witnesses in front of Congress, the knowledge of the nation for lawmaking increased 300%. The look of joy and change and hope on their faces that they had been asked to share their voice with the most consequential lawmaking body in the world was tremendous.
Well, I was coming with all of my arguments to share, and I was ready to just argue for the pros and cons, and then I wasn't able to do that because you guys invited me to play a game, and that was actually great because I got to know the other people and talk to them and connect with them before, entering the room and leading with our arguments and our opinions.
Agreement is not always possible, not is it always preferable. But understanding can garner you respect and peace.
And yet, if our goal, at least one of our goals, is to build civic muscle, you build muscle by doing exercise. If the machine does the exercise for you, the muscle atrophies. And so there's a real question about AI for good. Where's the role of AI within this kind of system?
AI is a tool, the choice is ours. So people say AI will do this, AI will do that. No, it's kind of like software. It's a very broad-based set of technologies. How it impacts journalism, fact-checking, our society is really depends on the policies we put into place, the consensus that we build.
Can AI and technology play a role in giving more people, particularly
those who are low propensity voters, but certainly affecting all, more information and better information faster and less through the lens of interests that have a particular desire or a particular goal or trying to manipulate a particular group of people.
I talked a lot about it in the Main Commission, and Claire and I spoke at length about this idea of if you're a news organization, do not assume people trust you, but you need to actually gain their trust.
Understand that trust exists in communities. So how can we, with humility, work and partner with communities as opposed to swoop in, parachute, extract and leave, which is ultimately what many trust institutions have done.
I think of these technologies as social technologies that co-evolve with us.
I think the best balance we can do is by basically leaning into what AI can offer and the strength of AI, and then still keeping the human element.
Wonderful. So we're gradually coming to a close. I would like to thank Dimitra and thank Deb for this, for sharing some of the work and also for this activity. And to thank again our panelists, Audrey, Tang, and Claudia, Chwalisz, and Deb for their participation. But most of all, really, to thank all of you for being with us, for showing up, and for such wholehearted participation this evening. It was really wonderful to have you with us. And to mention, this is an area that we're very interested in exploring further with the MIT Museum. So if you're interested in coming on a little journey with us, we're interested together with Claudia and Deb and hopefully with some further insights from Audrey. We are interested in having some deeper dives into how one can explore collective listening in the context of the MIT Museum and trying things out. So if any of you are interested in being part of that journey, there will be, as you come down to leave your beautiful drawings and share them with us of your hopes and concerns, please also leave your email address on the sign-up sheet there if you're interested in hearing about those workshops. We're still thinking about when we might plan them, likely sometime early in the new year, but we'd love to have you join us. And I hope now that you'll join me in thanking everybody for their participation this evening, and we hope to see you again soon at the MIT Museum. Thank you.